cousins spread lies about me at the family reunion. I had proof that silenced them all. The family holiday was supposed to be perfect. Here I am, Kate, after several years away from home, finally returning. My mother had invited me repeatedly, but I always found reasons to refuse: work, personal affairs, endless plans. But this time I decided that everything would be different. My family was going to be more important, and I was ready to leave everything behind and return home, where they were waiting for me. I hadn't seen my family for a long time, so this seemed like a great time. How wrong I was. When I arrived at their house, the atmosphere was full of joy and festive mood. My mother greeted me at the door, hugging me as warmly as if I had been here only yesterday. My father, standing in the corner, smiled his typical, reserved smile, which I always found so calm, even soothing. But that was only the first minute. Everything changed in the next one. Most of all, my cousin Elisa was waiting for me at the party. We were very close when we were younger. She was the one who always attracted attention, the one all the relatives admired. I always remained in the background, like a shadow. Not because I didn't try, but because Elisa had her own charisma and ability to win the hearts of everyone around her. Since I left, we hadn't kept in close contact, and I could feel the animosity in the air between us, as if there was something in the shadows that I couldn't see for a long time. In general, I always felt a certain tension in her behavior. As soon as I entered the room, Elisa would become cold and alienated. I didn't understand why at the time. Now that I was back, I was ready for anything. But I couldn't imagine what was waiting for me. As soon as I started talking to my family, it became obvious that something was wrong. Everyone was happy to see me back, but it was a kind of superficial joy. Elisa sat quietly, her eyes were cold, and her smile was too forced. I began to feel that there was something important that was being hidden from me. I might not have noticed it before, but now I was ready to pay attention to the smallest details. It all started when my mother said that we needed to discuss important family matters in the afternoon. I sat at the table, looking at my relatives, trying to understand what was going on. As soon as we sat down, Elisa started talking. She mentioned how I forgot about my family, how I abandoned them, and didn't think about what would happen to them when I left. Her voice sounded like she was sure that everyone would agree with her words. And an ironic smile appeared on my face. I already knew that there was more to it than just painful envy. It was a real manipulation. I cannot say that I was completely stunned. Knowing Alice, I assumed that she might use such tactics to get more attention from her family. But what she did this time was so obvious and straightforward that I was even ashamed of her. She decided to completely distort reality. And unfortunately she succeeded. The family began to react to her words, even though they were not true. Everyone began to look at me with suspicion, as someone who forgot about everyone and did not take care of them. My mother, shocked by her words, asked me why I hadn't told her earlier that I was having a hard time. She had no idea what was going on, and was trying to find a way out of the situation without asking important questions. But I realized that what was happening had nothing to do with my efforts to help my family. My career was important, but that didn't mean I didn't care about my family. This was the first signal that Alice was using my success to reinforce her false words. And then I realized that we had another big fight, not between relatives, but between the truth and the manipulations my cousin had created. I was ready not just to watch, but to participate in this fight. Would my family be on my side, or would her words and manipulations find supporters? This was a question to which I had no answer. But I knew for sure that this evening was just beginning. The next few hours were difficult. The family discussed various aspects of the festive evening, and although Elisa tried to dominate the conversation, I still felt that something was completely wrong. The looks on my face became so cold that I could no longer just sit there and be silent. All these suspicious hints, these hostile glances. All this could not be accidental. Every move, every word Elisa made looked like she was trying to create a real story that I would have to justify. And then at one point she said, "Kate never paid attention to us, we were always just a burden to her. She considered us her burden." And this hint that I hadn't paid attention to my family struck me right in the heart. Elisa knew that my childhood was not the easiest. I grew up in an environment where every day was a struggle, and I didn't get a real sense of family until I was older. My mother couldn't give me as much attention as I needed, and my father was always immersed in his work. I didn't know what it was like to just be in a family where you are understood and supported. And it seems that this became the weak point on which Elisa decided to build her game. The looks of my relatives, who seemed to have already believed in her words, made me feel even more isolated. I felt like a stranger among those I considered my family. But I knew it wasn't just because of my relationship with them. It was a manipulation that I had to protect myself from. I could not allow her to continue to create an image of me as a cold and uncaring person who did not care about his family. At that moment it occurred to me, I have to show them the truth. If Alice is using lies, I have to find a way to do it right. My hands were trembling with excitement, but I knew I had to act immediately. During dinner, I began to watch everyone carefully. Everyone was trying to support Elisa, but at the same time, they didn't seem to know what to say. It was like a game of chess where everyone was making their own move, and I was just waiting for the moment when I could put my spade on the right square. But what surprised me the most was how well Alice had prepared her supporters. They even started to mention how it was hard for everyone without me, and how I didn't answer their calls, although in fact it wasn't true. I always tried to keep in touch, even if I couldn't always come. But one thing that surprised me the most was that one of my older brothers, Jacob, who usually stayed away from family conflicts, started supporting Alice. This amazed me because I had always considered him to be on my side. He remained silent for most of the evening, but when Alice hinted at my absence again, he suddenly spoke up. Maybe it was really his decision, Kate? You were always too busy with yourself. His words sounded like a knife to my heart. It was unexpected and it hurt a lot. But as soon as he said it, I felt something wake up inside. I knew that I could no longer remain silent. It was the moment when everything had to change. I got up from the table and went out to the balcony to recover a bit. The air was cold and sharp, but exactly what I needed to bring myself back to reality. I thought about everything that had happened, about how Alice was manipulating me, about how the brothers and sisters I loved were trying to make me look guilty. And then I realized, I have one advantage. I have evidence. I had always recorded certain moments in our family, those details that could have changed everything. They didn't know that I was keeping all these moments, and that was my trump card. As soon as I got back to the room, I decided to make the first move. I knew that this moment would be the key, and it could change everything, both the family's reaction and my place in it. I had the truth in my hands, and I believed that was what they were not expecting. I held the phone in my hands, and my fingers were literally trembling with excitement. All these years of trying to keep everything under control, to prevent anyone from finding out the truth about my relationship with my family, it was all leading up to this moment. This was my last card, the card I could use to turn the tide. I looked at the faces of my relatives. Everyone was sitting there with strange looks, as if they were waiting for me to say the next thing. And here it was my time. I pressed the button, and at that moment I heard the sound of the video recording. It was unpleasant, but I knew I had to show them why I acted the way I did. I decided it was now or never. A scene appeared on the screen that I had recorded a few months ago. The moment when Elisa was angrily opening the door to my room and trying to take away my personal space to find something that could destroy me. The video captured her gestures, her words, and the way she tried to throw me off balance by manipulating facts and words that seemed to have only one purpose: to humiliate me in front of my family. Everything was in the frame. Her facial expressions, the way she silently molded an image of me, using my weaknesses against me, and even the moment when she tried to accuse me of disrespecting the family, not knowing that I was actually just trying to keep all these problems inside me, without unnecessary conflict. Everyone present was looking at the screen in silence, and I could see the expressions on their faces changing. They were beginning to change their attitudes, but they didn't know how it would end. Every frame of this video was a silent proof of her manipulations. Elisa was sitting looking at me, her face was confused. She didn't seem to know what to say. She was ready for anything, but not this. Every word she had been churning out over the past few days began to look empty, meaningless. I showed her what she was doing behind my back. I was surprised to see that Brother Jacob's expression began to change. His eyes grew bigger, and he looked at Alice in surprise. It was the first time I saw that he was really beginning to doubt everything he had believed in. Those on her side began to look at each other nervously. I could see the questions starting to form in their minds, and without even knowing if they believed it, they were already beginning to doubt her words. And at that moment, when it seemed that she should apologize or somehow explain her behavior, Alice just kept silent. And this silence was worse than any of her words. "Why did you do that?" Jacob asked silently, without raising his voice. His words sounded like he was ready to finally understand what was really going on. I looked at him, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just disappointment. It was an attempt to find the truth in what I had just shown him. But Alice did not answer. She just sat there, as if considering whether she should say something or leave it at that. But I realized that her tactics were no longer working. She could no longer dominate. And so, I realized that this moment would be key for the whole family. Although this video revealed the truth, I knew that much would remain unspoken. My family started watching the video over and over again, and I could hear them quietly discussing what had happened. I was no longer the person I had been in their eyes until that moment. I had become someone else to them, a real person, not just a shadow they could manipulate. But everything still remained uncertain. Are they really ready to admit their mistakes? Would they admit that I was not who they imagined me to be? Would they forgive each other for betrayals that they may not have noticed themselves? I was on the verge of understanding, but there were no answers yet. The moment the video ended, I felt it was hard to breathe. Everyone sat in silence. It was as if the whole world had frozen for a second. I could see the eyes of my relatives, who had been looking at me with condemnation a minute ago, now trying to figure out what to do about it. Elisa, who had previously been confident in her rightness, now looked as if someone had torn everything that had been in her plans out of her soul. She was alone, without the support she was used to receiving from everyone who was on her side. Jacob was the first to break the silence. His voice was calm, but heavy, like a stone that is hard to get to the bottom of the water. "I don't know what to say." His words hung in the air, and I felt him trying to find some form for his thoughts. But at that moment I realized that his words no longer mattered. He had seen what was happening behind the scenes, and could no longer choose sides without knowing the whole truth. "You knew it was so hard, didn't you?" I finally said these words, looking directly into Elisa's eyes. "You knew that I had to hide it from everyone because you were taking away my opportunity to be a part of this family. You knew it would be easier for you if I stayed silent, and you used every moment to keep me at a distance." Alice tilted her head, her eyes widening in shock. She tried to say something, but the words didn't come out as easily anymore. Now that her mask was off, she looked as scared and uncertain as I had been. Only now everything was clear. All these years of keeping me at a distance, manipulating and mocking my weaknesses, she was actually afraid that I might see her true self. "You know that you were the first one to start, right?" She tried to justify herself, but her words sounded meaningless. "You've always been like this, always." But I wasn't listening anymore. I looked at my relatives and saw how they were beginning to change their attitudes. Now they saw who she really was. None of them said a single word in her defense. And I knew that they all felt how hard it was to be betrayed. All these years, Elisa had skillfully played the role of the victim, but now she had to face reality. And the reality was that she had been deceiving everyone. Everyone in the family began to react in their own way to what had happened. My mother, looking at Alice, seemed to finally understand why I had kept her at a distance. She didn't say a word, but I could see how hard it was for her to accept this new truth. Now she was no longer sure that we had all been the same for so long. Alice tried to escape from this situation, tried to justify herself by inventing new explanations, but I was no longer listening. I didn't care what she had to say. I no longer cared if she apologized or blamed me. Those moments when we were all silent were more important to me than any words. I looked at Jacob. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time: surprise, shame, and even disappointment. It was the moment when he realized that everything he believed in was not true. And now he was faced with the fact that his choice, to support Elisa or me, had become impossible. "Couldn't you have told me earlier?" he asked quietly, turning to me. I looked at him and answered without any emotion. "You didn't want to listen before. And perhaps, I was also afraid to tell you that it was so painful that even I did not know if I could bear the truth." Everyone was silent. My family, this whole family that had once been so close, seemed so far away. I stood here in the heart of this chaos and felt everything we had built begin to crumble. And although the video showed the truth, I realized that this was not the end. But the moment I looked at Elisa, I knew one thing: she would never be the same person she was for us. And even if this situation unfolds differently, I will not allow her to manipulate us anymore. The silence that reigned in the room was so heavy that every movement, every glance seemed too cumbersome. We all sat looking at each other, searching for answers to questions that we didn't even dare to say. Everything had become too real now, and there was no turning back. All these years of lies, manipulation, and indifference had now been revealed before our eyes. Elisa sat there, her hands clenched into fists, her face covered in red with anger, shame, and perhaps even fear. She could not understand how things had gone so far. How this plan she had so carefully constructed had suddenly fallen apart like a house of cards. She had lost everything: her reputation, her place in the family, the trust of the people she had kept at a distance for so many years. But the biggest thing she lost was her support. I understood this even without words. None of her relatives came to her defense. Instead, I saw looks filled with doubt. I saw how they were beginning to reassess their relationship with her, how hard it was for them to accept that everything they believed in was just her manipulation. Why? Aunt Margarita, who was sitting next to her and watching closely, finally gathered her strength and asked, "Why did you do that?" Elisa looked at her, and I could see her face begin to change. She is trying to find words, but they no longer sound as convincing as they used to. All these years she had been creating her mask, and now she was trapped, with no way out. I didn't think it would have such an impact. I just wanted to be important, to be loved. Her voice sounded almost like a confession, but it was not the confident, manipulative person we had known before. There was no strength in her words, only confusion and fear. She did not want to confess, but she was already forced to. And I began to realize that she was actually afraid of losing attention, afraid of being forgotten. She was afraid that we would all find our place without her, and she would be left out of this circle, out of the family. All these years, her aggression was just a reflection of her own fear. And even now, after the truth was shown to everyone, she remained alone in this world where there was no more room for her lies. But then I realized that the most important thing was not revenge or a battle for a place in the family. It was my victory. I stood up for my truth. I didn't let my family silence me. I didn't let them think I was less important. I looked at my family, at their faces, and I felt them all start to change. They begin to realize that they can no longer maintain the illusions they have been trying to maintain for so long. They were beginning to see me for who I was, with all my weaknesses and strengths, but in the end I was real. And here, in this moment, when I felt that my world no longer depended on how others perceived me, I realized one important thing. Restoring family ties after something like this is difficult, and maybe even impossible. But that was not the main thing for me. The main thing was that I was able to defend my dignity, even when everyone around me was trying to break me. I didn't know how it would end, but I was sure of one thing: I was no longer someone who would live in fear. I was not ready to compromise my principles anymore. And even if it all ended in a break with my family, I was ready to move on. I now realized that recovery does not always mean going back to the old. Sometimes recovery is just a new beginning. I looked at Alice one last time. Her face was nervous, but it no longer had the confidence it once had. She was no longer the queen of this family, and that was the best thing that could have happened.